right, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our RTAP bi-monthly webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kara, and I am the Kansas RTAP Director. Please feel free to add your names in the chat box so we can all get acquainted. And in the meantime, I will just go over some housekeeping rules before introducing today's speaker. So just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. Please remember to keep yourself muted unless you are directly engaging with the webinar conversation, or if you have any questions. For today's webinar, we'll be hearing from Ryan Smith with the Great Plains ADA Center. Ryan graduated from the University of Missouri with a degree in education in 2001, spent the next 11 years teaching history and math and coaching basketball and baseball at rural high schools in Missouri. In 2014, he completed a second bachelor's degree in philosophy from Columbia College and was accepted into the PDH program at the University of Missouri, where he received a master's degree in philosophy in 2018. He spent one more year in public education before joining his wife in her small business creating 3D/VR tours. He joined the Great Plains ADA Center in December of 2021, following the same interest in ensuring equal access to educational, financial, and employment opportunities for everyone that drove his interest in education. All right. So without further ado, we will give control over to Ryan.
All right. Thank you, Kara. Glad to see everybody here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And now that you've heard the resume that I apparently wrote for myself as an introduction, it's always fun when you hear what you've actually written from that third-party perspective and then realize all the inadequacies of it. So, but with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. We're going to have a discussion today. I'll do some presentation, but I really want to get into, I'm sure you will have a lot of questions about the application of some of these principles, which is why my job exists, to explain that the ADA, while it does have requirements, those requirements are very a case-by-case basis on how they are implemented in almost every situation. So we'll talk about the principles that apply to reasonable modification in transportation, and then, like I said, have time for some questions, some answer, and discussion on the topic. So I'll begin sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone is seeing the opening slide of ADA and reasonable modification in transportation presented by myself. I'm the ADA Center Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator, which is a glorified term for I answer all of the email and most of the phone.
I have no audio.
Huh. You're not hearing me?
Oh, we can. It's all right.
Okay.
I think it was just a technical thing.
Okay, we're good to go?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I heard no audio for a second and I panicked. All right. So here's my introductory slide. Like I said, this is what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to do a quick overview of the ADA. And one of the first things that I want to highlight is the ADA definition of a disability, because it is very different from some of the other definitions of disability, particularly get a lot of questions about the difference between Social Security disability and disability under the ADA. The ADA definition of a disability is much broader, much more inclusive, much more expansive than some of the other definitions. So what is the definition of a disability under the ADA? It is a physical or mental impairment that significantly limits one or more major life activities. And we can get into I'll get into a little bit of detail here for a second about what that significantly limit and major life activities are. So those major life activities can be things that are visible. One of the things that is most obvious is someone that is using a wheelchair. That's a very visible life activity of moving around an environment that is significantly limited by a particular disability. Other disabilities are invisible, things like diabetes, which significantly limits your ability to process sugar in the body and requires some different approaches to your day-to-day activities than others who don't experience that. That significantly limits. That's meant to be interpreted broadly. Under the original ADA that was passed in 1990, the courts were reading it very narrowly. In 2010, they passed an update that included the standards for accessible design that formed the bulk of the built environment that we're operating, but also made sure to expand that definition of significantly limits to include a whole host of things that had previously been rejected. So some of the things that are major life activities can be speaking, thinking, hearing, seeing, processing information. There's a lot dealing with social situations. There are a lot of different disabilities where your ability to experience social interaction can be significantly limited. So it's a very, very broad definition. And in other presentations on the ADA, we get into a lot more detail of that. And if you have any questions about that, absolutely feel free to ask those. But for now, I think we'll move on to the next slide. So the ADA has got 5 titles actually, but most of the time we discuss 3 of those titles. Title 1 deals with employment. What are your rights as an employee with a disability? That happens to be my particular area of interest. And if you have questions on that, absolutely feel free to use my contact information at the end and ask about it. Title 2, state and local governments. What are the requirements for state and local governments with regard to individuals with disabilities? What do they have to do to make their programs and facilities accessible? So my understanding of the group that I'm dealing with today is that most of you, if not all of you, will be covered by this Title II of the ADA if you're operating a public transportation system. Title III, places of public accommodation. This is your business, are your businesses generally. The public term in there gets used in a lot of other senses to mean government and state and local varieties, but in this case, it's just where people are, where it's open to the public, which again covers almost all of your business and a few other instances that aren't those state and local government entities. And again, slow me down if I'm going too fast on any of this, but we'll move on. So what are your requirements under the ADA, under Title II? The big term here, and I've got double exclamation points on it, program access. So your programs, when viewed in their entirety, need to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. Now, I've got the question here, does every building or bus need to be accessible? Building, not necessarily. Buses, as we'll get into in just a little bit, all of your new buses and most of the older ones that you've had an opportunity to provide updates for are going to have certain accessibility features that need to be built in. But there are some aspects of this program access that do allow for some buses to not necessarily have accessibility features, especially if you're not running a fixed route system. Those are cases where paratransit might be meeting your program access requirements. There are ways to meet the program access requirement that don't require that each individual vehicle you operate via your public transit meets ADA requirements for accessibility. But generally speaking, program access in the public transit means that you've got your vehicles that you're using meeting the standards I'm going to go into in the next couple of slides. So your program, busing in this case, or public transportation, needs to be accessible when viewed in its entirety. And it, as I said, can be through a variety of means that I'll get into more detail in the next few slides. So I'm seeing a red dot in the Q&A. Kara, is there anything there you think I would be wise to address at this point, or move on forward?
Not just yet.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay. So this next slide here is directly from a document that I provided a link to at the end. Well, I provided the the URL, which takes you to the PDF, which did not show up as a link in the presentation, but that will get you to the right location where this was drawn from. No, actually, this one does have a link. The other one's from PDF. So here are a few of the requirements for Title II transportation. If you're a fixed route provider, you have a few set obligations under the ADA and the Department of Transportation. Your vehicles need to have seats marked as priority seating for individuals with disabilities. That doesn't mean that no one else can use them, but they are priority to be set aside, and individuals with disability can claim those seats above others. You need to have stop announcements at transfer points, major intersections, destination points, and any stop requested by a driver with a disability. So in order for individuals who may not be able to see that they've arrived at that destination, that particular stop, there need to be announcements that they can hear. There needs to be destination and route information on the vehicle. There need to be locations and devices to secure wheelchairs. And again, there are some exceptions for older vehicles, but as with most things under the ADA, you need to have a really airtight explanation of why that particular one doesn't meet the obligation for that to stand up in court, should you have a complaint lodged against you. You need to have a lift or a ramp so passengers who use wheelchairs or mobility devices can get to the right location on the vehicle. Moving along. Here are a few other requirements. They must have stairs and doorways that have good lighting and slip-resistant surfaces. There needs to be enough space for wheelchairs to turn and maneuver. Need to be accessible handrails and vertical rails, and a pull cord or a stop button within reach of the wheelchair area. So the photo here is of exactly such a button, and you might notice on there that there's also a braille on that, which is usually a requirement should you have any kind of signage or operable part such as that. Your staff. Oh, go ahead.
Quick question, Ryan,
Mhm.
on that last slide. We had a comment said this is for fixed route buses. What about on-demand services?
On-demand is going to have to meet these. This is where your program access part comes in. You need to have vehicles that can accommodate individuals with disabilities, that have features that will allow you to, for example, handle someone with a wheelchair. And those people need to have access to that very similarly to individuals without disabilities. Is that coming close enough to answering your question? There's the on-demand, it gets into a lot of it depends. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but you need to be able to modify your policies and procedures and have vehicles that can accommodate individuals with disabilities in the various manifestations that disability presents.
That's great. Thanks. They said
Okay.
that answers their question.
Okay. So staff should be trained to operate vehicles and equipment safely. I think that hopefully goes without saying. Need to understand that individuals will need different assistant types based on the disability and the individual. It's not a one size fits all. It's not even a one size fits all for a particular disability. And we'll get into some of the more widely recognized categories of types of assistance different people with disabilities might need. But again, understanding just from a base standpoint that each individual is different and they're going to have different needs that you'll need to be able to respond to respectfully. Also need to be able to assist people with disabilities in a respectful way, use good customer service, disability etiquette, each of which constitute a training of longer than an hour on its own. And if we have questions about what some of that is, but some of the things that we go over when we do those presentations are using person first language, individual with a disability, not disabled person, where you're not centering their identity around their disability, but centering them as a person first with a disability second. Not everyone who has a disability prefers to be addressed that way, but it's a good general starting point. Not offering help is fine. Insisting that someone needs help is not good disability etiquette or customer service. Again, if you have any questions on that, feel free to shoot them at, I guess Kara is going to handle that today, but we can talk about that more. But if there aren't questions, I'll move on and we're going to start talking about a different topic that is really the heart of what we're talking about today. What is a reasonable modification? And it's a reasonable modification to policy or procedure. A lot of times, and in the employment part of Title I, they're called accommodations for the workplace. And that is a good way to understand what we're doing in these reasonable modifications to policy or procedure. And I have the next little statement here. The rules apply to everybody except when a modification is necessary to ensure access. So the rules don't have to change based on a person's disability. They only need to be modified to make sure that they have access. And it's a good idea to construct your sets of rules with some knowledge of what is generally needed by someone with a disability. For example, some requiring a driver's license to access some kind of program. There are some individuals that are unable to obtain driver's license. Now, being able to have having a state-sponsored ID can often be a reasonable substitution, but that's a modification to the policy that a driver's license is required. And most of the time, that's pretty well understood, but sometimes we get caught up on the strict application of a rule, and we need to be understanding when a modification is necessary to ensure access. Another example that is really common and gets into a whole lot of interesting conversation is that a no pets policy should be modified to allow service animals. It's in fact required by the ADA pretty explicitly. Emotional support animals, not so much. In fact, not at all required. But no pets policies should be modified to allow service animals. Most of the discussion that we'll end up having are on what constitutes a reasonable modification. Most people are going to only ask for, and sometimes not even ask for, all that they need. But there are times where people are going to ask for something that is not reasonable. And we'll discuss some of the cases where something is obviously reasonable or ought to be reasonable, even when it's not necessarily obvious. some of the things that are unreasonable as we go on through this. I've got a link to a document that had 27 listed examples of what are and are not reasonable. That's about as definitive as you'll ever get on what is a reasonable modification and what is not. The rest of it is in this discussion of what constitutes reasonable. So what are some exceptions, though, before we get into the details of what is reasonable? There are some exceptions to request for reasonable modification. If the modification constitutes a direct threat, that has a very narrow and specific definition that we'll talk about. If it constitutes a fundamental alteration to the program or the service or the product or the building itself, that can be an exception to a request for a reasonable modification. If the request is unnecessary for access, and again, we'll talk about the definition of each of these in the next few slides, or if it constitutes an undue financial or administrative burden. So I'm relatively certain there'll be questions on each of these, but let's go through the definition and an example in an attempt to clarify and head off some of those before we get started. So what is direct threat? When the health or safety, and or safety of other individuals is directly threatened by the request for the modification. Now, when the health and safety of the individual in question, the individual that is requesting that modification, that you're usually going to defer to their willingness to accept risk. But there are cases in which you can request a modification because it is unsafe. But it needs to be based on real threats, not assumptions of what their threats might be based on a disability or based on appearances. One of the ones that comes up most commonly, and it is talked about in a lot of the service animal presentations we do, there aren't any breed restrictions on service animals. There aren't breeds of dogs that are just inherently dangerous as service animals. So the threat of a service animal needs to be an animal that is not under the handler's control, or as I'll get into a little bit later, something that's showing actual aggressive tendencies, growling, barking, biting, snapping. That would be a direct threat. The dog itself, because it is a breed that is associated with some of those behaviors commonly, that's not enough to constitute a direct threat. It needs to be active, credible threats to the health and safety of others. And again, I fully anticipate we'll have questions on what does and doesn't constitute that at some point. So went through a couple of these already because I'm getting ahead of myself here. But service animals growling and barking, direct threat. Often. Everything I say here is going to be often, frequently, usually. There are very few absolutes under the ADA. But generally speaking, if a service animal is growling and barking, that is justification for calling it a direct threat. If there are specific credible threats of violence, I'm going to stab everybody on this bus, and they have a knife, that's definitely a specific credible threat of violence. How much of the words themselves need to be taken seriously? That's going to be on a case-by-case basis as well. But usually if somebody's making a threat and they seem to be serious about it, that is a specific credible threat. If there's an actual inability to follow the safety protocols, even with modification, that can be an example of a direct threat. Moving on to fundamental alteration. The definition of this is a modification that would change the function of the program, service, or area in which a program takes place. So we got pictures here of what would be an accessible route there down to the beach. But once you get to the beach, it's not required to have a concrete path down to it because that would fundamentally alter the experience of the beach. Nature areas are often cases where fundamental alteration comes into play. How does it work with transportation though? So some of the examples of what a fundamental alteration would be in transportation is if you if someone asked to significantly change the route for a fixed route bus, to significantly extend the hours that those fixed route bus run, or asking a driver act as a personal aid for an individual with disability would fundamentally alter the job of that driver. They are not a personal aid. And again, there are some things that you can be asked to do, but being a personal aid exceeds some of those limited services that a driver can be expected to perform. Modification can be an exception if it's unnecessary for access. So a modification is unrelated to the accessibility needs of the person requesting them. And all of these examples are hard to articulate, but this one in particular, it's hard to articulate without the risk of creating misunderstandings. But one example might be if a person is asking to use a wheelchair lift to get in the bus when they're not a chair user. That is a modification that could be reasonable under some circumstances, but it's not necessary for that person to use that lift to access the service of or the program that the bus is providing. And one last one is undue financial or administrative burden. Definition of that is a modification that has prohibitive cost added to the provision of the service or requires significantly greater time and effort to administer. One example of undue burden might be requiring a sign language interpreter for a passenger to communicate with the driver. That's a request that people can make. Now, if they have an interpreter along with them, that's probably not going to be an undue burden to allow that person to accompany the individual with a disability, but asking that the bus provide interpreter services for an individual with a disability to ride is probably going to be an undue administrative burden because of the difficulty in obtaining a qualified interpreter, the time and expense necessary for that to happen. There are other ways to meet the effective communication requirement that you would have in the conditions under which you'd be communicating to a passenger on the bus, and that wouldn't necessarily require having an interpreter present. So take a moment here to see if there are any questions that have added up about these concepts, and then we'll move on.
Not seeing any questions in the chat just now.
Okay. That's good. Then if that's the case, then we'll move on. So now we're going to move into the list of examples that are drawn from that document I mentioned from the Department of Transportation on what does constitute reasonable modifications and some examples of what are unreasonable out of things that get requested often and have been, in a lot of cases, what ends up where the specifics come up are in court cases that have been taken usually and judgments that have come down consistently mentioning these things as either reasonable or unreasonable. So one of the things that has been listed as reasonable is if an individual with a disability asks the driver for a little bit of help navigating when there's snow and ice, either getting onto the bus or off the bus safely. So a little bit of physical assistance there is typically a reasonable modification request. Another one that is typically reasonable, actually, again, I'll go more, typically is probably not the appropriate word here, is almost always reasonable. A request to be picked up and dropped off at a preferred location if there are multiple entrances to a building. If the individual with a disability has a preference for one entrance as opposed to another, that's on the route or very near the route, that's usually a reasonable modification. Our current research project over our past grant cycle has been checking on people's experience with accessibility getting into medical care facilities. And that's one of the big things there. And I've had some technical assistance calls where people have said, hey, I'm getting dropped off at a location that is a prohibitive distance for me with my disability to get into the building. Yeah, it's the same place everybody else gets dropped off, but with my particular disabilities, it's problematic for me to have to make it from there. If there's another possibility, another entrance that someone could be dropped off at, and they have made that request, it's almost always reasonable to grant that request. A request to be picked up on private property as opposed to on the public street, usually going to be a reasonable modification request, assuming that it can be done without, again, significantly altering the route or some of those other things that we've mentioned and some other things that I'll get into a little bit later. But generally speaking, if it's merely pick me up in this parking lot as opposed to on the street because of my disability that requires that I travel a shorter distance, that is generally a reasonable request. So I see a question pop up there. Carrie, you want to read that to me? Mm-hmm.
Yes, it says, for on-demand trips, would we be required to pick up in an alley if they prefer to come out the rear door of their home?
I'm going to go with probably on that, depending on what the conditions are in that alley, how difficult it is to access, any kind of safety and risk to the vehicle, or there's one a little bit later on where it will talk about height turnaround spaces that become difficult, and those would apply. But again, unless you've got good reason to say that alley creates a problem for your on-demand pickup, then yeah, that's probably a reasonable request, because we're going to assume that they're asking for that because it's an easier and not just an easier, but a significantly easier route for them to navigate with their disability. Okay, ready to move on? Okay. Some more examples of what have been adjudicated as reasonable modifications. Asking that you park the vehicle to avoid obstructions like construction, snowbanks, parked cars, etc. Hopefully those things aren't in the way, but again, we see in the picture here a bus stop where the snow has been plowed, but plowed up in ways that block the access from the seating area onto the bus. And I'm not seeing in this particular picture a good place to pick someone up close by, but if there was a place a little further ahead, a little further down the sidewalk where that snow wasn't piled up, or where construction isn't interfering, there isn't a parked car in the way that has to be navigated around, that's a reasonable modification request. Asking for assistance in handling the fare, whether that's the person saying, hey, I've got the money here, can you put it into the I'm not really familiar with all the ways, haven't used a lot of public transportation in the very, very rural area that I'm at, so some of this stuff is just based on stuff I've seen on TV. So say you're having to put coins or bills into a machine, and that's a difficult thing for someone with dexterity limitations. Asking for help handling that fare is a reasonable modification request. if there's if it's more of a card or token related thing, again, if they say, hey, can you help me use this system, and they have got a disability that limits their ability to do so, that's a reasonable modification request. Eating and drinking, if you got a no food or drink on the vehicle policy, but you have an individual, say with diabetes, who needs to have things there to regulate their blood sugar, that would be a reasonable modification request for that person. And this would be another one where, yeah, eating and drinking is a reasonable modification if it matches up with the disability. This would be a really easy one for that, not necessary for access exception. Yeah. So someone using a wheelchair, if they didn't have this diabetes or some other disability that matched up with that, this wouldn't be a modification for them. It wouldn't be necessary for access for them, even though this would be a reasonable modification for someone who needs this for accessibility. Going on with some more examples here, we're going to get into some of the not reasonable ones in this slide. A request that medication be, excuse me, let me try this again. A request that they be allowed to take medication while on board. Now, you don't have to assist with the administration of this medication. In fact, for liability issues, would probably highly recommend that you not. But they can take their medication while on board if that's necessary for accessibility. If they have medication that needs to be taken at particular times, and that time falls within the range they have to be on that bus, that's a reasonable modification. For a lot of individuals with disabilities, it is often reasonable that they get a 5-minute warning phone call when transportation is about to arrive. Now, the first one here that is not usually reasonable is that an individual can't request a dedicated vehicle for themselves or special equipment only for them be provided. That's not a reasonable request under most circumstances. So this is a kind of a mixed bag here as far as what is and isn't reasonable on this slide. Asking for an exclusive trip or a reduced capacity paratransit trip is not usually a reasonable accommodation. This would be the fundamental alteration exception, right? That these routes, paratransit or some of your other ones, they're not exclusive to an individual. Now, could you grant this request? Absolutely. But you would be permitted to reject that on the basis of it being a fundamental alteration to your service, if it is going to fundamentally alter your service. If you're if a request to go outside of your service area or beyond your operating hours, that's not usually reasonable. Again, it's a fundamental alteration of your program. Personal care attendants are a reasonable modification. So a lot of individuals with disability, I know we've got our staff who has a personal care attendant with them at most times. Admitting that person is generally a reasonable request, but you're not expected to provide that kind of personal care for an individual with a disability. You can't say, no, you can't ride, only the one person. Now, the question that I would be almost guarantee will arise here is, do we have to let that person ride free? I'll want to double check my answer on this one. If that question comes up, I'm not certain whether usually they have to pay for another ticket in most cases, whether it's going to a ball game or like at our conference, but I'm not confident in that answer. And if you have that question, let me do some double checking on that before I Well, don't take my word for it is what I'll say. Let me do some checking. Few more examples. Requesting down payment or the fare waived is unreasonable in most cases. I have a disability, I shouldn't have to pay is not a reasonable modification request. Requesting that the driver or another employee take care of a service animal is generally an unreasonable request. Now, would a request to hold the leash of the service animal while they handle the fare be a reasonable modification? That I'm going to go with probably. But hey, I'm going to go into this building, I'm going to leave my service animal with you. That's not a reasonable modification. Asking to feed or otherwise take care of it, not a reasonable modification. A request to open the doors to a building is generally considered a reasonable modification. So there are times where, again, if it's not a huge distance, isn't going to fundamentally alter the service, isn't going to require that you take enough time that you get off schedule or abandon other positions, then yeah, if an individual with disability asks that you open a door into a building for them, that's probably going to be a reasonable request. Again, case by case, but in a lot of cases where that's asked, it will be a reasonable request. Request for specific drivers at a modification is usually unreasonable. Handling luggage or packages is often unreasonable, assuming that that's not a service you provide. Assistance during extreme weather is usually reasonable. If it's hailing, this time of year we're going to get some extreme weather, offering some assistance to get them to the next safe place is usually a reasonable request. So here are the resources I mentioned. There's a fact sheet there from which a lot of the information was drawn on what the requirements are for fixed route buses. The second one has similar information, and then that Chrome extension is a PDF that goes to the DOT document where you'll get a definition of direct threat, the things that the 4 categories of direct threat, as well as the examples I mentioned of what are reasonable and unreasonable modifications. I think there are 27 different ones of those. I just did a kind of a highlighted selection of those. And our contact information, our website, which has got a lot of good information on it, my email address, and the ADA Center email address, which I'm probably going to be the one that answers that as well. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go to questions and answers.
All right, feel free to drop those questions in the chat or unmute yourself. I know we get a lot of questions here at RTAP about reasonable modifications, so now's your chance to ask those questions.
I intended to mention and somehow left off the slide, any of the slides. In Title II, Title III of the ADA, a service animal is a dog that provides, that does a particular task related to a disability. In transportation, it's any animal that does a task related to a disability, that provides service. It's the only place where that definition is expanded to other animals, and I really struggle to see how that would work. Why someone would have a service animal that is, say, a monkey that they take with them in transportation, but then wherever they get to, they're not going to be able to take that anywhere else. But the definition is expanded in transportation, and I intended to mention that in the presentation, but there it is.
Do we help carry a person's walker onto and off of the bus?
My guess would be that that would be a reasonable modification request. You should, and again, we in the slides we mentioned having storage for wheelchairs. Trying to remember if they included other mobility devices, but you should really anticipate that you're going to have people that use walkers and going to have a place to store those on a bus. And yeah, probably giving some assistance with that would be a reasonable modification request.
Okay, and then another question here. If you have passengers that are afraid of dogs, would that be an unreasonable modification category?
No, other fear of dogs is not a reason to reject a service animal. Allergies also not necessarily sufficient to deny a person who uses a service animal to bring that service animal on. In employment settings, the allergy can be more of a balance, but in general, a service animal should be allowed anywhere a person is. Now, the service animal is required to be under the handler's control at all times and not threatening. But people who are afraid of dogs, that's not enough of a reason to deny the entry of the service animal.
I'm gonna test your memory here, Ryan.
Okay.
We had an agency who reached out to you last fall about a driver who was refusing certain passengers, I guess, and you were able to provide some guidance. Do you recall what that guidance was and when it is acceptable to refuse a passenger?
Um, I have just enough memory of that I remember that I had that question. I'm not remembering enough of those circumstances to speak to it in ways that I would be able to do that confidently. But I would refer back to that direct threat. That's what I remember the question kind of circling around, and that definition of direct threat is probably going to be what applies to those kinds of cases.
Okay, all good. I don't have much information about the situation, but I was just curious to see
So
if you
I'll
remember.
be looking it up in either my notes or in the data system that we have and trying to find that now, because that is really going to itch my brain if I don't find that one. So
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Any other questions for Ryan?
Somebody had put on the question and answer that people often say they have an emotional support animal. Is that acceptable, or is only trained to do a particular task?
only have to admit service animals. So a service animal is there are two questions you can ask about a service animal. Is this a service animal trained or for an individual with a disability? You can't ask what the disability is. What task does it perform related to a disability? That's the second question you can ask. And if they can answer those questions well, then they should be allowed to bring that on. Now, I've had a whole question and answer period with some of the Kansas City transportation people about all the different attempts to represent an animal as a service animal and ways in which those questions weren't answered very well, and reasons to be skeptical of certain people claiming to have service animals, but emotional support animals are not the same thing.
Thanks for pointing that out, Trey. We're still getting used to transitioning from our Zoom platform to Teams. So
I
there's,
just saw a little red bubble on it, so I figured I'd check into it.
yeah, there's multiple places to check now. Thank you. All right. Do we need documentation for a service animal?
There is no ADA documentation for a service animal. In fact, that's usually kind of it's not necessarily a red flag, but there is no legitimate organization that certifies a service animal. It performs a task related to a disability, and that's the definition of a service animal. Try to keep those barriers low. Yeah, I can only ask the two questions. Now, in Kansas and Missouri, and I believe Nebraska, service animals in training are also covered under state law, so be aware of that. And we can do a little bit of checking on exactly how each state law applies, but I don't know those state laws to the degree that I know ADA.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right. Not seeing any pop up
Okay.
or anybody unmute themselves. So thank you again so much, Ryan. This has been super
Absolutely.
helpful. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. So please be sure to check that out.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks everybody for having me. Thanks for the questions. Really appreciate the opportunity. And if you have any questions that come up down the road, feel free to call, email, and I can actually get you to the experts on the subject rather than myself on any particular one. So thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.